Good day and welcome to Central Spotlight. I'm your host, David Nelson, Professor of Mass Communication here at the University of Central Oklahoma. And of course, Central Spotlight is a focus on faculty, staff, and students and some of the accomplishments and achievements they have completed. And today with us is Dr. Mark Silcox. He's the chair of the Department of Humanities and Philosophy. And good day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be had here.
And Mark, you made your way to Oklahoma through the University of Toronto and the Ohio State University, and of course today we're going to talk about a book that you edited titled Experiencing Machines, the Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. And but before we get there, how did you end up in Oklahoma, and what was your path?
It's the usual sort of circuitous story of an academic career these days. So I started off I was born and raised in Canada in the suburbs of Toronto and did my BA there, and have just followed, well, it sounds cheesy to say that, but the money ever since. So Ohio State offered me a fellowship. I ended up there, thought that Ohio was Oregon until I looked at a map. So I had a couple of weeks thinking I was going to be on the Pacific. Spent 5 years in Auburn, Alabama, which you probably heard of, the drinking school with the football problem, and taught philosophy there while I finished my doctorate. But was on the market for about 9 years for a tenure-track job and applied almost everywhere. I think I hesitated briefly at a few places in the Middle East that were being bombed, but apart from that, was looking for anywhere I could find a permanent job teaching philosophy, and came here to substitute originally for a colleague of mine who was out on sabbatical, and then just out of blind luck, a guy who was interested in all the same stuff I was, moved to Vermont, leaving a place open for me. So I found myself in Oklahoma. Didn't confuse it for Oregon, didn't really know much about the way of life here, but it's turned out to work out really well, and just sort of being able to make my home here with with a seamless transition.
Nice. And then, you mentioned, of course, philosophy is one of the main courses you teach, and of course you obviously spent a lot of time understanding the history of philosophy. And you mentioned Toronto, Canada, Marshall McLuhan, and others come to my mind.
I know he's a bit of a hero around these parts. Yeah. My dad actually knew him. Yeah, they were foes when when McLuhan was just getting famous. My dad was a grad student. They'd show up to all the same colloquia and get into these vicious arguments. And I kind of wish I was there, because I don't know whose side I would have been on. But McLuhan was a major figure at Toronto, and I started off as a classicist there, actually. Learned a lot of Greek and Latin before he started writing all this stuff about media. But it was a lively, fun intellectual atmosphere in Toronto, even when I was there. Different figures. But Oklahoma has its charms too. There's a growing, very sort of young, lively philosophical community in this state who are more and more reconciled to being here, partly because of the rigors of the job market, and partly because it's a nice place. There's a bit of a network of academics in this place, partly because we're so cut off from bicoastal America and have to make do with our own stuff. So I've been pretty happy here.
Great. Now you mentioned your father, and kind of get a little bit to know a little bit more about yourself. What was it that your father did, and how did he draw you kind of towards this idea of philosophy and the interest in it?
Not at all.
Really?
That's a deeply practical man. He's a political scientist.
Okay.
And mostly a university administrator for most of his career. But would bring us, my sister and I, when we were kids, onto the university campus from our kind of rather wretched high school, and we'd get to see what life was like on a university, and we both very quickly decided that we really weren't interested in living anywhere else. So my sister and I both, as a result of my dad's influence and his enthusiasm for running these places, I guess, have been wedded to them ever since. My sister's an anthropology professor at Toronto right now. So that was the influence. I'm very, very second generation in that respect.
It's in the DNA.
Yeah, pretty much. My dad was first generation. His father was a bus driver, but I think it catches after one generation. Yeah.
Well, the book you edited called Experience Machines, the Philosophy of Virtual Worlds is kind of a look at Nozick's view of this idea, which I found fascinating. It's the first time I was introduced to Nozick's philosophy on this idea of kind of, both neurologically connecting with media and then somehow as a result experiencing events, persons, places, or things, through this virtual connection through technology,
Right.
and then he proposes that, however, if you were to do so, even if you were able to desire, experience anything you desired, most people would refuse to
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah, that's his hypothesis.
Now, so I was fascinated by that, but you kind of have a counter argument to that.
I'm
No.
a bit ambivalent, to tell
Uh-huh.
you the truth, as you always end up being when you edit a book on something. But yeah, it's this very swiftly delivered but very famous argument by a political philosopher named Robert Nozick, who taught at Harvard in the 70s. Mainly famous as a libertarian and as being maybe the most intellectually serious libertarian in the American tradition. But it's a little thought experiment he does, like the old-fashioned thought experiments from the Renaissance, like Newton's bucket and Galileo's falling balls, and people would back then decide scientific questions on the basis of these imagined circumstances. So Nozick thinks you can answer ethical questions by imagining a scenario, kind of scenario that probably would get talked about in the mass comm building as much as anywhere, where you have access to a machine that can provide you with artificial, permanently pleasurable experiences. He calls it the experience machine. He says, imagine that, I think as he puts it, super duper neuropsychologists, right, far, more advanced than anybody we have over in this hike department, can find a way to hook you up to some sort of machine, to take it a computer with a neural interface that could provide you with all the experiences you wanted, or alternatively, all of the experiences that are most objectively enjoyable for you for the rest of your life. But you can't permanently unplug because of, I guess, some physiological reason or maybe some slightly sinister political reason. So the question that he asks is would a reasonable person, and would you, my reader, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, would you plug in? And Nozick believed the answer was obviously no, and that there were important but less obvious reasons for that, which once you understand them and see them, rule out a lot of very famous philosophies, moral philosophies, and philosophies of what's valuable about human life. So it was even before my generation of philosophers started to look at this in connection with actual media. It was a very famous and controversial argument because it's a simple solution to a lot of complex questions, as Nozick delivers it. I guess I don't think it quite works. But that's what the debate in my book is all about, is about what it really does show and whether really reasonable people nowadays really would refuse such an opportunity the way Nozick thinks that they would.
And it's fascinating because based on this 1974 book that you mentioned, of course, what Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he was kind of ahead of his time, very much like Marshall McLuhan. Many of the ideas and concepts and constructs he created were very much well ahead of what. But if they were present today. And he, of course, he lived until 2002. So he saw the turn of the internet.
And
Nozick.
It's always been a bit of a disappointment to me that he didn't write much more about this. He reframed the argument a few times, and of course, in a way, this argument is ahead of its time because it's the argument that every reflective person has when they walk out of the Matrix or Existenz or Avalon or one of these, films about virtual worlds and realistic virtual worlds and what it's like to inhabit them. And it's an argument that a lot of people who play a lot of video games have. People who occupy these multiplayer games, fairly rich ones like Skyrim or Second Life, and start wondering, well, in what sense am I in this world rather than in my external world, and is that a good or a bad thing? But Nozick had very little to say about the personal computer revolution and very little to say about actual media, which in various ways to various degrees resemble the experience machine. So he was ahead of his time, but he was also pretty abstracted from the cultural and technological changes that happened that made his thought experiment a little bit more pertinent to everyday people. So my book's kind of an attempt to fill in that gap, to say, well, now that reasonable everyday people have a more vivid sense of what it would be like to live in an online environment or live in the Matrix or the world of Existenz or one of these other dozen or so movies about VR. Would that change their intuitions, or would it change the stakes of Nozick's argument?
And you mentioned Neo from the movie Matrix, and mentioned Keanu Reeves' character, and how does that character kind of demonstrate what he what he proposes.
Well, the Matrix is a weirdly ambiguous series of films by the time you're done with it, right? And I've got mixed feelings about it. I think the third one was pretty terrible, with all the endless punching back and forth and all
the martial arts. And all,
yeah. Unless you're really into that stuff, it's difficult to retain your attention.
Right.
But the fundamental idea behind the Matrix, and what I guess is the idea that Nozick would approve of, is there's something deeply wrong with discovering that you're in it, and there's something deeply not attractive but human, and worthy of respect to want to be out of it. And what makes Neo the hero of the story is his desire to get out of the Matrix and find what reality is. And when it turns out to be a bald guy sitting in a bunker eating tapioca pudding out of a tube, we're supposed to admire him for being more authentic by sticking to that and by going back in to rescue other people. And that's very close to Nozick's perspective. But there's a subtext running through all those movies. First of all, suggesting that there's nothing so great about the world outside the Matrix. And there's a famous line from Morpheus when he says, "Welcome to the desert of the real." That if you take only a little bit more seriously than the movie does, becomes really disturbing. And there's also, of course, by the end of the film, you've lost all sense of what's the Matrix and what isn't. And maybe you've lost a little of the sense of whether it really matters. And I think that between all the kung fu battles and the weird CGI in the films, that was part of the goal of the Wachowski brothers when they made those movies, was to change the stakes of the debate by shifting them from ethics to epistemology and saying, how can you even judge whether it's good or bad to be in the Matrix if you don't know where its boundaries are?
And then I found fascinating that you just described the symbolism, built in here's reality, a desert, some guy eating. Heavy-set guy, balding guy eating that. So the symbolism itself is communicating to the audience that it's boring. In some ways, this virtual world that we have is our escape from boredom. You made me remember the scene. The movie's not. I'm not recalling the movie right now, but it dealt broadcast. It wasn't broadcast news, but of course. It's the movie where the guys lean out. I probably shouldn't even bring this up if I don't recall it, but leaning out the window, and I'm tired of it. I'm not going to take it anymore.
Oh, is that Network, maybe?
Yeah, Network.
Yeah.
I remember the scene.
Yeah, classic, yeah.
He stands in front of this audience and says, hey, listen, we never tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Go to your gods, go to your gurus, because everything you know is through this damn tube.
Yeah.
And only 3% of you read.
Right.
And
right.
so,
and that's
a boredom killer, is what he essentially says.
Yeah, and of course, in the idea of that film, although that film ends up ambiguous too.
Yeah,
right?
it does.
A little unclear who to sympathize with, but this is a point that Nozick makes. He says we've. To a certain extent, and in the most, maybe respectable portions of our lives, we value knowledge over pleasure. And confronted with something like the experience machine that you could never leave, you would realize that. You would realize, although the experience machine provides all the pleasure I could possibly get, because everything is an illusion, I just can't debase myself enough to go in there. And one of the points that I made in the original paper I wrote about this with my collaborator, John Cogburn, is that that's not the way our interaction with virtual reality works. As a matter of fact, you can learn a lot about the world through virtual reality, and not just the case in games or VR, but in experimental science. More and more in science is being done with computer simulations, right? In meteorology, of course, but also in complicated things like trying to find true magnetic north. It's just a computer model that's set up, and it tells you where it would be in the computer model, and you can infer, that's where it must be on the Earth, rather than sending people around in planes or digging big holes in the crust of the ground, right? So the idea that virtual experience and simulated experience are somehow always an impediment to knowledge, that seems to me to be quite wrong. And if it weren't wrong, I would agree with Nozick, but I think there's all sorts of reasons to suppose that it's an epistemic advantage to have this veil put between yourself and reality. There's also things you can learn indirectly, but just as substantially.
We're talking with Dr. Mark Silcox, chair of the Department of Humanities and Philosophy. The book is titled Experience Machines, The Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. It's a volume which includes authors who kind of use Nozick's argument as a platform to look at everything from social media, you mentioned virtual worlds and things of that nature. You talk about this idea of experiences with video games, for example, in virtual worlds. There's a book titled The Media and the Moral Mind. Tamburini was the editor of that particular book, and he discusses about how much of the research indicates that when we engage in a virtual world like video games, which graphically, my goodness, they're very lifelike. Our brain actually initially, intuitively sees it as a reality. And then shortly after then, in order to morally self-sanction ourselves, as he describes it, the ability, of course, to kill, we immediately reason shortly afterwards in order to to rationalize that it's okay to kill this character for multiple reasons. Number one, it's not real. Number two, well, he's a bad guy. Number three, and you find all these reasons. But these are moral acts these are acts that we would not morally find acceptable in the real world, but yet we tell our brain it's not real, but yet the brain finds this to be actually initially a very real scenario that it's experiencing in these virtual worlds. Has that influenced, or have you seen any literature on that idea? Or
actually that's something I'm really interested in. It's what I've been writing on most recently, is the psychology of the transition between real and virtual worlds. And of course, talking about virtual worlds narrowly here in the first place with the kinds of new VR technologies that people are only now becoming mainstream, but more generally too, something like an online game could be a virtual world, something like certain sorts of experimental environments could be virtual worlds, and in a broader sense, really deep immersion in traditional media, even theater or television, places you can make you feel like you're in kind of a virtual world. And it's one of the things, to be honest, that I would have thought would have really interested philosophers, especially anyone who's familiar with Plato's cave allegory about the transition out of this virtual world of shadows into reality, but that for the most part media scholars have been thinking about much more carefully. I was thrilled last year, on the basis of the publication of this book, to be invited to a big conference in Krakow, Poland, which was about a third philosophers and two-thirds media scholars and game designers. They wanted me to give a talk on this very topic, the topic of what goes on ethically and psychologically in the transition to virtual reality. And the most famous thing that's been written about this is an essay by probably the most famous philosopher in the English-speaking world right now, a guy named David Chalmers. Chalmers' view is a little like the one you described, which I have to admit I haven't encountered, and it sounds fascinating, in talking about how you start off, when you're first immersed in a virtual world, seeing the things in there as though they were real. And so, you're worried about falling over them or maybe getting a crush on someone's avatar. And then he says, Chalmers thinks you pass from what he calls a naive stage to a sophisticated stage, at which you see the objects in a virtual world as virtual objects. And he doesn't talk much about the kind of ethical numbing that could take place there, because he's mainly interested in metaphysics. He wants to talk about whether a virtual object is an object and how that it should influence our view of what's really real. I really have no stake in that debate, but my concern about this, and the topic of a paper that I'm publishing later this year, is that the transition from realism to sophistication, I guess, about virtual worlds, whatever order it happens in, whatever influence, whether it goes back and forth, I think there's a danger in talking about that sort of too abstractly, because for me the really important transition is the transition between having the aims of an everyday person, everyday life, having the aims of a gamer. Most virtual reality environments are games, even ones that we use for practical purposes, like, say, Skype or Facebook. What's the Facebook VR app? Facebook Spaces, I believe. Not used very much, but it's becoming more popular. Even ones that we use to fulfill our everyday need for communication or knowledge. We treat in a very game-like way. We take on these artificial purposes that we wouldn't have in everyday life, like making a friend that you'll never see in real life, or like rescuing a princess, or something analogous to catching the king in chess. And for me, the key to decoding this transition is to understand what it's like to take on an artificial temporary purpose that you're given by the medium that you inhabit, rather than a purpose you have because of your nature. And how that affects you psychologically and ethically, and how it can be used or abused politically as well.
Well, we'll come back and continue to talk about that. I'd like to pick up where we left off here, and we'll take a short break. You're listening to Central Spotlight. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Silcox, Chair of the Department of Humanities and Philosophy, and we're discussing the book, Experience Machines, The Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. And we'll return right after this. Welcome back. This is Central Spotlight. I'm your host, David Nelson, Professor of Mass Communications here at the University of Central Oklahoma. And today my guest is Dr. Mark Silcox, Chair of the Department of Humanities and Philosophy. And we're discussing a book he edited titled Experience Machines, The Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. And we're kind of right now in a virtual world. A form of one, I guess,
kind of,
in a way.
Absolutely. All the lights do make you feel
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about hedonism. First, I'll let you define it
Sure.
Based on your book and the standard definition, and we'll talk about how pleasure and pain is incorporated in this experience, this virtual experience.
Okay, so hedonism is a very ancient view in philosophy. Is discussed extensively by Plato and Aristotle. Only really endorsed by philosophers in the later tradition. Plato and Aristotle are a bit equivocal about it, but it's just simply the view that all goods are reducible to the good of pleasure. Everything that's valuable can have its value best understood in terms of the value of pleasure and the disvalue of pain. And there's a companion view, which is less interesting but distinct, psychological hedonism, which is the view that all we in fact do value is pleasure and all we do in fact disvalue is pain. But philosophers are far more interested in the ethical view, because the psychological view is something that tends to be resolved by stipulation. Just depends what you mean by the words, right? Whereas the ethical view is one that you can have substantive debates about, right? So Nozick thinks that his argument refutes hedonism in all of its forms, in all of its plausible, bizarre, esoteric forms, all the different versions of it that philosophers say in the utilitarian tradition. I know a lot of students study utilitarianism in their first year classes, have disagreed about. They're all false. And the reason why they're false is because a hedonist would be required by his own philosophical opinions to plug into the experience machine. It would be irrational for any hedonist not to plug in. And yet, Nozick thinks it's just obvious when you think about it, for about 3 pages worth of argument in his book, that there are excellent reasons not to plug in. Even if the machine could, first of all, give you any experience you desire, or any experience you maybe didn't desire, but that would be objectively pleasurable for you. And he interestingly, adds a little structure to the experiment by saying you could even unplug temporarily to change your menu. So if you plug in for, say 2 years and just eat candy and go skiing, and think you'll like that forever, but change your mind, you can unplug after a while and change it, as long as you always go back in. And Nozick thinks that even with that very generous stipulation, reasonable people wouldn't and shouldn't plug in. And that shows hedonism is false.
And from your perspective, in this world, this connected world that we may have, there is pain. There's experience. People do experience pain, and you kind of use virtual world video games or the virtual world, if I recall correctly in your book, as an experience where people can take on these avatars, and actually in this experience they have in this virtual world, actually experience pain, racism, prejudice, things of that nature. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, anything that counts as a virtual world we can currently inhabit is always a mixture of these affects. For 2, I think, distinct reasons, one of which is that temporary virtual worlds that we plug into for experimental or amusement purposes, we don't necessarily build them just to replace and improve our everyday lives. We build them partly to reflect everyday phenomena in everyday life, including the discomforts we feel. Also for the deeper reason that there seem to be some sorts of pleasures that are better because they're what Jeremy Bentham referred to as mixed. Better because they include some component of pain or some component of triumphing over adversity. So take the easiest example, lifting weights. Weightlifters always say no pain, no gain, right? If you're not hurting, you're not doing it right. But the whole experience of doing it is, of course, a valuable, irreplaceable pleasure for them, right? And any kind of pleasure that involves overcoming a challenge is going to involve a little discomfort. Nozick's sensitive to that. And Nozick hints, the best experience machine and the best menu of experiences in one would involve the feeling of triumphing over adversity, which means it would also involve the feeling of adversity. just a little bit less adversity than we actually have to get kicked in the teeth by in real life. Right?
Yeah.
And when Nozick says that, and when people on both sides of the debate say that, I personally think, wow, maybe I'd plug in. Because I don't mind adversity, and my life would be meaningless without certain sorts of pain and discomfort. But there's just a little too damn much of it for my tastes, right? So how about if you could rejig your life to just have enough adversity that you could triumph over it?
Mm-hmm.
That's a more, I think, intuitively attractive version of the experience machine than just the one that gives you endless waves of carnal pleasure, I suppose, which would, I guess, get pretty boring.
And the one you describe, the former you describe, is more engaging. The way you describe it, where, as he describes it in '74, it's almost force-fed. Here's all this pleasure, but as you're describing, someone is actually taking steps to have some outcome.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that Nozick and I think some of the more naive writers about media and about virtuality get wrong is that you really can't interact with it without being active in some sense. A place where this is done very nicely is this novel that Spielberg recently made into a movie, Ready Player One. Kind of a pulpy sci-fi novel with the usual kung fu battles and whatnot. But I encourage everyone who's interested in this stuff to read that novel, because what's brilliant about it is the way that the interface is described. The way that a character who has total immersion in virtual reality actually acts. And it's actually a great workout, and his brain develops. And in the real world, although he's covered in mesh and goggles and stuff, and would be a little creepy to any of us, the world is designed to be responsive and designed to offer him challenges based on preferences he expresses through his virtual actions. So it's not force feeding at all. The other nice thing about Ready Player One is that outside it, he lives in a trailer park in abject poverty with caretakers who don't look after him. And the message of the book is, if your life sucks that bad, maybe you'll be a little bit rational in a different way about the experience machine than comfortable middle-class people who are all obsessed with their own authenticity. So it's a really fun book in that way, and I think a different take on the thought experiment that Nozick has, and one that I think he would have disapproved of but been made uncomfortable by.
And so we're looking at, in many ways, when we talk about what you're just describing, is this idea of what is the use of using this technology? What is the gratification that results from this using of this technology? What needs are met, or what escapism is occurring? And as a result, literally taking your cognitive portion of yourself into is there a point where you take the unconsciousness and move it into the consciousness realm? We talk about this idea of, as I was mentioning earlier, how the brain engages with this virtual world, sees it as a reality temporarily. We reason consciously that it's not. How does the unconsciousness and this consciousness transition work in this world?
It's an interesting question. And long before Nozick, before anybody had even begun to envision this idea of an artificial interface with the virtual world, philosophers were fascinated by dreams. And the very idea that there is a human unconscious, first was explored carefully by the Freudians, who thought that it's revealed in your dreams, right? And anyone who's played, especially a very sort of open world multiplayer game like Garry's Mod or Second Life, quickly recognizes how much it looks like a dream. And how much of the stuff people are doing there seem to be manifestations of these weird half-conscious urges that real life, of course, makes us suppress, right?
Right.
And for Freud, the reason why our dream life is full of unconscious urges is because we can act upon them in dreams without harming anybody, because we're just lying there. But they're also dangerous, of course. And if you're not careful, you're going to need therapy because what you imagine yourself doing in your dreams.
Right.
I think there's a really close analogy there. And from Nozick's point of view, and this is where Nozick's libertarianism shows through, even though there's a sense in which we're freer in dreams, because it's illusion and because it's not really happening, there's always at least some element of compulsion. There's always at least some manipulation and trickery involved in getting our minds to engage with this stuff. And for Nozick, because we all love freedom more than anything else, or should, can never be palatable. As a non-libertarian, it doesn't bother me so much. I think, compulsion is one of those things that's intuitively bad, but that's worth undergoing for certain other benefits. And the question becomes, what's the trade-off? Okay? So if you don't believe, give me liberty or give me death. You might be willing, and maybe should be willing, to surrender a bit of liberty for the sake of experimenting with your inner world, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned illusions. And Tamburini mentions in the book I mentioned earlier, The Media and the Moral Mind, that often some philosophers believe that in this illusory world we create, of course, delusions.
Yeah.
Cognitively, and as a result, we often live in a delusional world based on these illusory symbols and responses we get from the outside world.
Yeah, that is actually a point that Nozick makes a great deal of. He thinks part of the problem is we have too much control over the virtual environment, and that there's something, to use an idiom people use a lot, there's something good about interacting with what he calls nature, by which he just means an environment that's unplanned and non-artificial. I'm sympathetic to that up to a point, although, of course, a world that's made by human beings is still natural, because it arises from our nature and our natural urges, right? So it's a bit of a fudge to use that word in that way. But everybody, I think, has an intuitive sense of what he means. And there is this worry that if you build a world based on the desires you have while you're building it, and then you try to interact with it and trick yourself into believing in it to even little extent, there could be this weird, dissociation, right, between the two different sets of aims. And that's not a problem you have when you're out walking the street, right?
Right.
Although you're more likely to be hit by a car, so again, it's a trade-off. Right?
Which is man-made.
Yeah.
Man-made technology.
Or I guess fall down a hole, right?
Yeah, and how does Neil Postman, we talked a little bit about Marshall McLuhan, how does Neil Postman work into some of the literature? I love Neil Postman's comment. He once said, a lot of people can tell you what technology has done for them, but very few people can tell you what technology has undone for them.
Yeah, I have very strongly mixed feelings about Neil Postman. I love the book Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yes.
Because I grew up in a TV-addled generation, and I think much of the secret to my success, at least in academia, possibly in life, to the extent that I've been successful, is more or less entirely abstaining from television for a long period of my life. Not because it's something maybe inherently bad in the medium in quite the way that Postman envisages, but because it really is a top-down way of distributing media. Your tastes really are determined, especially in the 70s when there were only 3 networks, by decisions made by people a long way away whose main concern is to sell you stuff, right? Postman also has these later works like Technopoly, where he makes much broader generalizations that start to sound even a little bit like Heidegger, the great opponent of technology in modern philosophy, about how all of our attitudes toward technology have this uniformly inauthentic and uniformly self-destructive character. We all need to go back to the 17th, 18th century, I think is his favorite, where we were more autonomous in dealing with our problems, right? Where by we, presumably, he means a bunch of wig-wearing aristocrats who knows what the rest of people were doing.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm a little less friendly to that. I think, the first rule of interacting with technology is discriminate, right? Find the good stuff and use it, find the bad stuff and abandon it. Large-scale theories of the technological and its influence on human authenticity, I think, are doomed to incoherence. But boy, he's such an acute and powerful critic of television that I'm reluctant to just shrug off anything he says more generally.
And we see, you mentioned television. And you and I both, not sure how old you are, Dr. Silcox, but I'm 50. I just turned 50 this year. So we grew up in that era where mainly most of our media would have come from television. We had the 3 strong networks, and you talk about top-down. Right. And literally, what we see today, though, with social media and other forms of media, these algorithms, how does algorithms play into our understanding and our extension, as Marshall McLuhan would describe, our extension of self, when really the algorithms feed us a very narrow, or in a sense, provide us a very narrow view of the world through the way we use media?
This is an idiom that media critics are using quite a bit now, algorithm talk. In the first place, I think one has to be very careful with the concept of an algorithm itself, because an algorithm is just any discrete process with a discrete outcome, right? Very persuasive reasons that a lot of philosophers have given for supposing that we're algorithms. the human nervous system, and the human biological system. We're not natural robots exactly, but everything we can understand about ourselves is algorithmic processes of interacting with the world. So the very most general notion of the algorithm is, I think, too metaphysically loaded to be helpful in criticizing media. What people usually mean are algorithms that our preferences are fed into and that commercial opportunities are fed out of, right? So marketing algorithms and things like the kind of software agents that Amazon's been using for a long time to predict incompetently what my next favorite book will be, right?
Right.
And that's, I think, it's the same. It's a more insidious version of what was going on in the 70s with television when content was being decided by the preferences of advertisers, right? And there's something, in a way, comforting about thinking back to the 70s when it was just some guy, in a suit, chain smoking in Manhattan saying, well, I think people like stories about babies, or I think we should use these obscenities on television, not using these obscenities because we'll sell more toilet paper. Yeah. Whereas now, people with Harvard degrees in engineering are letting machines make that decision. I'm not convinced it's worse. The thing about advertising is that a lot of people who work in it are very malevolent, whereas machines, or at least insofar as they are machines, pretty neutral. So it's a bit of a trade-off, right? But one of my contributors in the book, Peter Ludlow, has this lovely anthology of papers about the internet called Crypto Anarchy. And he says, the great thing about the personal computer revolution is that it provides you with the resources to isolate yourself from this intrusion, right? You're just staring at a TV screen. You're getting everything that people want you to see, right? Even if you're like me and get up to the bathroom or go get a snack for every commercial, you're still being advertised to. Whereas there's enough sort of a surplus of resources on the internet that you can create these little indigenous spaces, however temporary, that are kind of utopian, because you have the technological means to resist the intrusion of even the deepest, most aggressive algorithms. And even on a platform like Facebook, you can, I think, more effectively resist this intrusion into your preferences that people are trying very hard to make than you can with other more one-sided media. So he's used cautiously optimistic. He says, you get these temporary autonomous zones, as he puts it. With the internet and with computer technology that other media can't provide, and that its designers have no interest in providing.
And so the consumer resistance, we see a lot of examples of that now, as you're just describing, with the advancement of technology. And we just have more control over these pervasive ads, for example. Ratings. We go back to the 70s. You describe it simply a human punching in whatever data they received from a very inaccurate recall by many people, what they watched, what they didn't watch, and made decisions based on programming from a very incomplete science.
I mean,
today.
I think anyone who's an optimist about the internet or the virtual worlds that it makes accessible as media for political activism should be ashamed of themselves after 2016. But maybe it'll get better. And that's what's a bit sad about this vision of Peter Ludlow's, is that he thinks, no, that's the only thing that's politically good about new media, about post-1980s personal computer media, but that you can isolate yourself, that you can go live on an island. And his views are a revival of the utopian tradition of early communism and of certain sorts of religious communities, where you build a virtual wall and hang out in it with your friends and make sure the algorithms can't penetrate. That's about as well as you can do politically for a guy like Ludlow, and I find it, at least at present, hard not to agree. Video games are just so much more friendly than comments threads.
There's no doubt. No doubt. Well, we're talking with Dr. Mark Silcox. He is the chair of the Humanities and Philosophy Department, and we're discussing the book Experience Machines, which he edited, and in the virtual experience with these machines. And we'll return right after the short break. You're listening to Central Spotlight. Welcome back to Central Spotlight. I'm your host, David Nelson, professor of mass communication here at the University of Central Oklahoma. My guest today is Dr. Mark Silcox, chair of the Humanities and Philosophy Department. He edited the book Experience Machines and the Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. And Mark, I'd like to talk about the unintended consequences that often come with technology and this inability by humans to see beyond this technology, and then as a result finding ourselves burdened with whether it be the economic perspective. For example, I was reading an article just a few weeks ago that discussed how technology has actually allowed society, for the good, to be healthier, longevity, but as a result we find ourselves at the unattendedly with the heavy burden economically to take care of this older generation.
Right. Yeah.
And so how is that discussed in the book, or is there some discussion amongst philosophers about this unattended consequence that we can't see?
Well, I think here, and this is what interests me especially about virtual worlds, both contemporary ones like social media and video games, and the future ones that we begin to imagine and that we're starting to build with the Oculus and other more sort of intimate interfaces. I think they're a bit of a special case. And the reason for that is that of course, as soon as a new thing like medium like video games or say Facebook become popular, there's all sorts of consequences to this that nobody envisaged, and that in our case, at least in the U.S., seems to be politically a little bit terrifying. But virtual worlds, insofar as they really exist and they're a category of thing, have this enormous benefit of isolating your activities from real-world consequences. And this is very important, for example, in experimental science, where by simulating, for example, a hurricane, you can generate, if you get the programming right, all kinds of data that you would normally need to get by sending someone out in a car into the middle of a hurricane. Just to take a relatively trivial example. And people who use online interfaces like Facebook, or for gamers something like Twitch, can socially experiment. And people who for whatever reason have had social difficulties or socially developmentally somewhat behind their peers. Not that that's everybody who uses social media, but can experiment and have sort of simulated failures and successes in their relationships that don't have the colossal economic and psychological real-world consequences. So the great thing about virtual worlds, and what ultimately makes me, I guess, kind of anti-nosec, is that if you're at all pessimistic about the unintended consequences of any experiment we perform in the natural world, you should be a fan of virtual world. You should be in favor of their proliferation, because they give us a chance to learn from our mistakes without actually making any mistakes.
Yeah, so you get in the experiment without the real-world consequences that come with it.
Well, at least without some of them. The trick is, there are things you can do in virtual worlds that are irrevocable, even though it doesn't look that way, and even though you're not used to thinking that way. So that's a source of moral risk, at least.
It may be off the subject a little bit, but I visited a panel at a conference that I typically attend in April in all places, Las Vegas. Speaking of virtual worlds, I feel like I'm in the Matrix.
Example, actually.
Oh, actually, really?
Yeah, especially the Strip.
Is that right?
Yeah. Well, all the fake Sphinx and the tiny weird fountains. Driving down the Strip feels a lot like a video game.
It really does.
A lot of video games are built on that model too. So yeah.
And so, is this why the stimulation must be unbelievable? You can, put some MRI, hook people up, if you will, in MRI. I mean, stimulation must be unbelievable walking down.
Yeah.
And I find myself now going to this conference for 20 years. The stimulation, I'm numbing. It's numbing to me now.
Yeah.
But I can recall the first time I would, as a 28-year-old, first year in higher education, how stimulating it was walking down with my older colleagues.
I remember going down this Strip the first time. I was on a business trip and I wasn't going to actually do anything there. But was sitting next to a guy who'd been there a few times. And I said, "Wow, this is a lot nicer than I thought. It'd be great for kids." And then I suddenly thought, "Oh wait, that wouldn't work at all."
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you see several kids in cribs.
Yeah.
As you're walking down.
Well, but it's not obviously not. They're not the purpose of the place.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. But going back to the panelists, the researchers, one particular researcher found that often those who were in these virtual communities would actually adopt an avatar that was completely opposite, both gender and race. Fascinating, but in this scenario, and you essentially kind of described it, they are able to get into a virtual world of what it would feel like as via the experience through the lens of, let's say, a white, blonde, blue-eyed female, though the actual person on the other end is what her research indicated, often African American females will take on that role, which I found fascinating in order to experience what it would feel like to be in this
I think
body.
That's absolutely true, and one of the things that I find attractive because of the experimental potential, I think it's easy to overstate. Being a white guy with a black avatar in Call of Duty is not going to stop you from being a racist necessarily, and it can even enhance that because of the sort of the vicarious thrills associated with this identity swapping. But it's peculiar to me, and maybe something that's politically and ethically exploitable. For example, how many very masculine males want to play women, especially in fighting games, and especially women who are depicted as being more vulnerable and with richer characters, even in something as narratively tried as, say, Street Fighter, right?
Yeah.
And how many women want to play men, and how they come up with their own little internal narratives about this, right? And it's a couple of things. It's escapist and experimental at the same time. I think it's very important to work out how those two motivations interact, right? How people can want to escape the world where they have all these social concerns, and yet they do it with these experiments that they could really learn from. And it's a problem in game design and the aesthetics of game design, the aesthetics of computer art, trying to make environments that allow for these two goals to harmonize. Okay,
interesting.
The game goal and the educational goal, and the ethical goal, I suppose. And if you go too far in one direction, it's just a weird orgy of fun that everyone comes out of confused. If you go too far in the other direction, it's like grandmother lecturing you, right? Very, very difficult to harmonize these two things as an artist and as a creator. And it's one of the places where the goals of the arts and the goals of education and moral instruction really, really overlap in a way that they don't, for example, if you say doing abstract paintings or running a Bible study.
And being a programmer of virtual reality, if you were to work in this industry, a liberal arts degree seems like it would be real valuable in some of the ethical dilemmas that may arise, or I don't.
Well, it's yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason I got interested in this first place was because while I was looking for a job in academia, I spent a couple of years as a freelancer working in the video game industry. I worked on two big video games, an N64 game and an MMORPG, neither of which were big commercial successes. It was fascinating, and the oddest thing was the place I worked in Vancouver, which was making a very, very complicated, narratively rich, high fantasy game for the Nintendo 64. So there was the upstairs where all the level designers and the freelancers like me, I was a writer and also did a little bit of coding at a very high level. And there were artists there, a lot of CGI artists and some musicians. There were the people who made all the substantive decisions. We go down with floppy disks back in the day and give them to the coders on the first floor and said, I want a scene where the hero, goes mad. Or I want a flirtation scene between the two, the male and female protagonists. Give it to me. And the coder would go, okay, boss. And then they get it back to you in 8 hours or 6 months, right? So it was a very militaristic hierarchy. But the coders all made 4 times as much money as us. And I was making $1,000 a month. I could barely make rent in Canada. But I had all this deliberative power. It was a fascinating, really fun job. I mean, I would have done it for free, so I can't really complain. But yeah, there is this, in the game industry, this sort of liberal arts math division. We were all friends, and we all had the same interests. We all loved games. But there still was a very deep cultural division. But there wasn't a lot of discussion of ethics. We were told what the game had to have in and what it didn't have to have in by the person who subcontracted us. The only time there was a real ethical dilemma was I got a little nervous about this high fantasy atmosphere and the representation of women in it, because the two main female characters were transparently a virgin and a whore. And I said, can't we take the edge off this and introduce a little subtlety and a little nuance in the depiction of these characters? And the response was, no. And that was about all she wrote. And even the people I worked with who were educated and clearly had feminist sympathies said, we got to sell the damn thing. and the expectations of the audience are written in stone for a game like this. So that was a bit of a downer. I think there's been progress since then.
And more gamers are females. And have you seen a change?
Which has made a big difference.
It has. Okay.
And I'm really excited, although I'm not a fan of the medium, by new games like Overwatch, which are crazed orgies of violence, which also think very carefully about how to represent the characters as diverse and fundamentally gentle and playful, rather than homicidal monsters.
Yeah.
I think that is partly a response to the change in market and the mainstreaming of that kind of game, but partly also to a bit more reflection and moral responsibility on the production side.
And speaking of violence, of course, video games and media research gets a ton of attention from those who are concerned about violence and how we experience violence via media technologies. How has, your view of, the certain political climate we're in and the hate, violence, how we experience violence, how we experience hate, how we experience other diverse lifestyles and things of that nature. Do you see social media as a divisiveness form of technology that is actually dividing society, if you will, into these smaller factions and causing...
I think that's pretty much indisputable.
Yeah.
There's a phenomenon that philosophers call the epistemic bubble effect, where only the criticism and the information of people within your own little community matter. I don't think it's an unequivocal bad, because there are problems that mass societies have too, and this enlightenment dream of nation states with 300 million people in them who all regard themselves as pals and all regard themselves as having a unity of interest. I thought was always a dangerous and horrifying myth. So that kind of social fragmentation can be a good thing, but all the moral responsibilities that we traditionally attributed to the state or to the education system still exist in these small epistemic bubbles, and no one. It's less clear who the authority figures are, and that's very dangerous. Then also you have this thing that we all vote in elections, right?
Yeah.
And we still want to keep some fabric of democracy in the real world, even though the way that information and knowledge gets propagated in the process that leads up to the election is unrecognizable from how it was 50 years ago. Obviously, at least our society hasn't done a real good job of coping with that. And libertarians like Nozick don't have much to say about it, except A, stay out of the virtual worlds, or B, unfortunately, to the extent that you stay inside them, anything goes.
Yeah.
Those are the two solutions that the libertarian, and I think to a large extent the American liberal tradition, have to offer so far, and they both seem creepily inaccurate and unhelpful.
And the ubiquity of social media and other forms of media and this extension of ourselves and understanding society around us, I think, like you just described, pushes us into these in-groups. And then we look at the out-group, though there may be multiple subcultures of that in-group, there is a sense, I think, within our own department that social media, though for its good purposes, also has politically factioned much of the population off into...
Yeah. I mean, it's the representation and the discourse about outgroups within these little epistemic bubbles is the scariest thing, right? I remember when I'd been just long enough in the United States when Obama was elected to not be surprised that Americans would elect a black president. And my foreign friends, my friends from Canada and from Northern Europe, said, how did this happen? How did this guy acquire such mainstream appeal? And the answer that I gave was always the same. Every American with a regular day job interacts with racially diverse people now. And whatever nonsense you might hear from your local KKK representative, if you're white, there's the lazy white people and the black people who work at the job, and that's going to change you, right? But it's going to change you less if you go home, switch on your computer, and vanish into a bubble for all your leisure time. That's really scary. But there's two ways to deal with that, and I think paranoia about the technology itself is the wrong way. The right way is to look more closely at these communities, and although I hesitate to use the term because it's loaded in American political discourse, to regulate them, either formally or informally, either at the government level or at some other level. But that's something that no one even really talks about that much.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the current climate of political opinion.
Yeah, we, when we were growing up, we would have, a lot of that would have been self-sanctioned by the big media
Yeah.
networks.
Yeah.
Things that, for things of conspiracy nature type ideologies never would have made mainstream media. But today, you have access to
True. Yeah.
things of that nature. That
And the reason why they were suppressed by the major media wasn't that of anything idealistic. It was to keep people shopping.
yeah, absolutely.
but-
It didn't have an audience.
Right. It
In
didn't
their
have an
opinion.
audience, and you couldn't sell toilet paper to this some small nutty group who thinks that the Earth is flat, right? And
Absolutely.
That's one of the unambiguous charms of capitalism that's also threatened by these insular groups, right? You can find ways to sell things to insular groups with Facebook algorithms and the like, before you can find ways to make sure that they're all able to get along with one another. And that is something that the people in the department are right to be nervous about. But again, I think technophobia can't be the right response to that.
Yeah, and which is historically has been the common theme.
Yeah.
All the way back to the early 20th century with the magic bullet,
Yeah.
hypodermic needle concept that the media is all powerful and can make people
Right.
do all things. So
Yeah.
this paranoia is really a natural, I think,
Yeah.
view by humans to
What
fear,
one finds-
fear something uncertain.
Yeah.
And
What one also finds is that the people who are most aggressively technophobic are the people who belong to the older and often more savage in groups that have been around
Yeah,
almost long
absolutely.
before we had the internet. So that's a concern as well, right?
We're Dr. Mark Silcox, the chair of Humanities and Philosophy Department. We're discussing many things that philosophers and others, and myself as a mass media. I teach a class course, Mass Media Effects on Society, so we often talk about a lot of the items here in the book, and some philosophers who have viewed the media from your perspective as a philosopher. I don't have a PhD in philosophy, but of course you have spent a lot of time understanding the philosophers and their view of technology and how we engage with it. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
And really
A lot of fun.
enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah.
And again, this is Central Spotlight. The book is Experience Machines, The Philosophy of Virtual Worlds. Dr. Mark Silcox was our guest. And until next time, thank you for joining us.